What if One Direction were a 60s bubblegum pop group? This week we're taking a quick look at the career of One Direction, the 21st century's biggest boy band. And we'll also be looking back to the 1960s bubblegum pop scene to find some of the earliest ancestors of the boy band phenomenon. All that and more on this week's What If, How and Why. Hi, my name is Morgan Brown, and each Monday I upload a new What If video to my YouTube channel, and then on Wednesdays follow it with one of these companion videos discussing the artists and genres involved in the What If video, and also sharing a little bit of my creative process. So the idea of the What If videos is that each week I pick a popular song and imagine an alternative universe in which some change of circumstances causes that song to come out completely different from the version we know and love. I then take the original lead vocal of that song and record a new backing track to it using just GarageBand and whatever instruments I happen to have to hand in order to bring that alternative version of the song to life. So the song I picked this week was What Makes You Beautiful by One Direction, and I tried to reimagine that as a 1960s bubblegum pop song. So if you haven't had a chance to listen to that yet, here's a little taster. For my sins, I did used to be quite a regular viewer of a bunch of those old Simon Cowell TV talent shows, including The X Factor. I eventually got kind of tired of it because it just seemed to get worse and worse every year, but I did watch for a good many years, and you get hooked into watching people audition. But the actual sort of build up to finding out who wins is always probably the least interesting bit, particularly because after a while you kind of realise that most often the person who wins doesn't necessarily end up with this promised music career anyway. I mean, they tended to manage to manipulate the charts so that they'd end up with a Christmas #1 for a few years in a row there, but beyond that, so many of the people, talented as they may have been, didn't really manage to sustain much of a career out of the X Factor. One of the not very many notable exceptions, of course, was One Direction, who didn't actually win the competition back in 2010, but certainly became one of the most successful, if probably the most successful act ever to come out of the show. Remarkable really when, as I say, they didn't win and were also pretty much thrown together on the spot from a bunch of lads who'd auditioned as individuals and not succeeded. You really wouldn't have necessarily put money on them doing a great deal, but seemingly by almost pure chance, they seemed to hit the perfect formula with One Direction, pairing this group of very photogenic, energetic young lads who we'd all seen auditioning, so we knew they could all sing pretty well, unlike some boy bands over the years, and then matching them with, at least initially, this quite different, punchy, up-tempo, power pop almost music. A lot of boy bands of the previous generation had been leaning a bit more into R&B kind of stuff, trying to sound a bit more serious and sexy. I guess One Direction, although they were strictly a vocal group, leaned a little bit more into the kind of stuff that groups like McFly and Busted had done, which blurred the lines a bit between traditional teen pop and slightly rockier kind of stuff as well. And those first couple of singles, at least, I've definitely just undeniably punchy, snappy little pop songs, drawing from bits of pop punk, bits of power pop, almost going back to 60s bubblegum pop, really. And it proved very effective. It was just different enough to what other people were doing at the time. And the guys in the band were likeable enough, engaging personalities, not hurt at all by the fact that the nation had been following them on TV, so people already felt like they got to know them to some extent. So they come roaring out of the gate with these irresistible little 3-minute blasts of energetic and modern sounding, but simultaneously kind of comfortingly familiar and slightly retro pop nuggets. it turned out to be a perfect recipe for them, really. And they went on, obviously, to then touch on all other styles, and you get things that lean more electronic, a certain amount of the traditional sitting on a stool being serious boy band balladry and all that stuff. But it really was that kind of power pop sound that got them off to that flying start. And they only had a pretty short run. What was it, like 6 years? But I think they managed to blast out 5 albums that time, which is pretty rapid going by modern pop standards, particularly given the amount of touring that people also do to support records these days, or rather the records, I guess, nowadays support the touring. I mean, maybe that was just a matter of the record company recognising that pop can be very ephemeral, so just wanting to get as much out of them as they could while the going was good, but they really did cover a lot of ground. I think from quite early on you could possibly get the hint that maybe Zayn was the least good fit in the band. I mean, it's amazing that they gelled together as well as they did, given that they were just thrown together completely arbitrarily on a TV show. But just seeing them occasionally on TV, I always got the vibe that maybe he wasn't quite so into the peppy, happy, upbeat vibe that they were often giving off. And so it wasn't a massive surprise when he was the first person who actually decided he was going to leave the band and went into a much more sort of serious adult direction. I think they did carry on for another album after that, but once members start leaving, it's often a bit of the death knell for pop acts like that. And I guess from that point out, really, Harry Styles has pretty completely eclipsed the efforts of all the other guys in the band. He's really carried off that trick of making that really difficult transition from flagrantly commercial, teen-focused pop to a point where it is actually being taken seriously as an artist by critics and by adult listeners. So he's done very well for himself. I mean, I think some of the critical plaudits thrown his way have been a little bit over the top. I've seen a few people trying to claim he's the new Bowie, which seems to be a claim made basically entirely on the fact that he's been known to wear sort of sequin jumpsuits. I wouldn't go that far, but, you know, fair play to him, he's done pretty well for himself. It's 10 years now since they split up, and it's one of those things where you can imagine that if they had reunited 10 years later, it would have been absolutely colossal. I mean, I'm remembering what it was like when Take That reformed, and you definitely could have seen One Direction doing something like that, coming back as a sort of more mature version of the band and having a sort of second lease of life. But sadly, after the tragic passing of Liam Payne, it seems like it's an unlikely thing now. Still a pretty remarkable run that they had in that group, and I guess in the time since One Direction has split up, the focus of a lot of chart-oriented pop music has shifted outside its UK and US sphere, and a lot of the biggest pop music in the world now coming from like Korea. So I suppose BTS have been the ones who've come along next to take the crown as the world's biggest boy band. I'm not particularly sure if there's any sort of Western boy bands coming up who are looking to challenge that K-pop wave or not, but I think if there are, they'll be hard pushed to have a more spectacular run than One Direction did. It's interesting to look back through the history of boy bands, because people have all kinds of different theories about when the phenomenon really begins. I saw someone on the internet the other day attempted to revive the old argument of, oh, the Beatles were the first boy band, which is absolutely nonsense. But I've seen lots of people kind of claim that. And I can kind of see where people get that idea. You know, 4 good-looking lads followed by hordes of screaming girls playing catchy chart music, but it's not really the same thing. And if you want screaming girls, there are plenty of precedents for that. Going back as far as Frank Sinatra with his armies of Bobby Soxers, through Elvis, or the teen idols who came up after Elvis, Fabian and Bobby Rydell and all those guys. But I guess what you could say is that the Beatles are one of the major ingredients that went to make up what eventually became the concept of the boy band. I guess the Monkees took it a stage further by being specifically put together with the goal of being a teen-focused pop band. But even with them, it's kind of a different thing. I mean, they're mainly put together for the TV show rather than as a musical group anyway. And then once they got the slightest bit of control of their music, they pretty much completely rebelled against any kind of teen pop and started making interesting kind of country rock and psychedelia. But I'd say the boy band phenomenon kind of really starts around the turn of the 60s and the 70s with the likes of the Jackson 5 and the Osmonds. So between that kind of British invasion and the Monkees, and then the debuts of these prototype boy bands in the 70s, there's kind of a missing link there. And that missing link for me is bubblegum pop. I mean, the term bubblegum gets thrown around for a bunch of different pop styles. It's a good descriptive term for any pop that is easily accessible to kids and kind of sweet to the point of being saccharine, and also ephemeral. You know, you chew your bubblegum for a few minutes, then you dispose of it. So it's been applied to pop that's considered to be ephemeral at various points throughout the ages of pop music. But I think the first point where it actually really did start to be used to describe a specific scene would be the stuff that started emerging in the latter half of the 60s, especially after the point where you start to get a bit of a dichotomy between rock, as in more album-oriented, more serious or artistic form that a bunch of bands started to gravitate towards, and then pop, as in the kind of music that's still more occupying the singles charts, more specifically aimed at teens. So I guess as groups like the Beatles have led the way for a lot of those sort of earlier 60s groups into these more consciously artistic musical endeavours, there's a bit of a gap in the market for someone to just make catchy 2-minute songs that kids want to buy. So you start to see some new young performers moving into that space, and also producers consciously creating a product to fill up that space as well, with music that often draws on that kind of earlier 60s beat group pop, but also quite often leans pretty heavily into soul music, especially Motown. It's incredibly catchy, it's got that sort of polish and that sweetness to it, it's danceable. So bringing those two styles together was often kind of a winning formula. So you get the charts gradually filling up with these new names, some of whom are legit bands who just happen to fall into this style that ends up being considered to be bubblegum, and some of whom have been very specifically put together in order to have hits in this style. So in the States, the likes of the Archies and the Ohio Express just had all these incredibly punchy pop singles, nagging, lightweight hooks, a little bit of rock and roll guitar in there, a little bit of soul funkiness, a little bit of the sweetness of those kind of Motown strings. But yeah, alongside the more cynically put together things, you also get a bunch of other performers who just happen to fit in with this wave of stuff. Tommy James and the Shondells, my personal favourites, who kind of just started out as pretty much a 60s garage band with fairly rowdy R&B stuff like Hanky Panky was their early hit, I think. Went through a few lineup changes, and then by 67 were making this really great, unbelievably catchy pop again that combined bits of their earlier rock and roll sound with this slightly syrupy production and these strong elements of Motown and stuff as well. And they had an amazing run of hits. I think We're Alone Now, Money Money, and then Crimson and Clover, where they started to go a bit psychedelic, and then from that point on started to edge themselves away from the Bubblegum label, which they never particularly enjoyed. Around the same era, you've got Tommy Rowe with Dizzy, which is an absolute beast of a pop song. And over in the UK, things like Edison Lighthouse with Love Grows Where My Rosemary Goes, which I've always thought was a pretty magnificent pop song. Again, huge irresistible hooks, that slightly saccharine, over-the-top version of a Motown production, but with these slightly rock and roll guitars underneath as well, just to give it a bit of edge and drive. It was a great little era for pure pop music. Most critical attention that focuses on that latter half of the 60s obviously goes to the people who are making the big kind of album statements, whether they be your obvious sort of rock greats or soul legends. But in the singles chart, a bunch of these great acts who quite often only had a little handful of hits were just cranking out some great pop music, which, although it maybe didn't make a massive critical impact, was actually kind of important. That stuff lays the groundwork for a lot of the next decade's glam. A lot of that stuff as well gets rediscovered by the punk generation. A lot of it forms a bit of the basis for the wave of 70s power pop. And as well as that, of course, I'd certainly say it forms an important precedent for the boy band format. So yeah, bubblegum may have been conceived as something that you chew for a few minutes and then throw away, but at least some idiots like me are still here talking about it 60 years later, so it can't have been all that disposable. But anyway, that leads me up to this week's alternative universe scenario. So in my alternate timeline this week, most things are the same as they are in our universe, except for in this timeline, all the members of One Direction were born some 42 years earlier. So it's 1968, and Obviously, for a couple of years now, a lot of bands who'd emerged earlier in the 60s have been gradually gravitating more towards album-based rock music, and a group of London-based talent agents realised that this kind of leaves a bit of a gap in the market for a hungry young group to fill up the void left in the singles chart by all these bands who are suddenly more interested in making albums. So they set about auditioning young guys to put together into a new group for this express purpose, and after auditioning for a while, they end up narrowing it down to Harry and Louis, Liam, Zayn and Niall, who they put together in a group which they call The One Direction, because it's the 60s, your group name's got to have the definite article at the start. And they decide that to conquer the charts, they're going to come up with this formula where they combine the driving guitar pop of pre-1965 Beatles with the hooks and danceability of the Motown sound, and also the slick, polished harmonies of groups like the Four Seasons, that kind of thing. So just a really slightly rocking, but also upbeat, slick and sugary product that's guaranteed to sort of win over teen fans. So they start releasing records, are immediately a sensation on both sides of the Atlantic. Teenage fans running out to buy every single they can possibly get their hands on, and it's like a new wave of Beatlemania for a little while there, but unfortunately it doesn't last that long. The guys quickly tire of their teen idol status, and they're seeing all these other groups making these bold artistic statements and kind of feel like they want to do that as well. So eventually it all becomes a bit too much for Zayn, and he leaves to launch a solo career where he makes a series of dark, brooding, melancholic albums in the Scott Walker vein. And that's the beginning of the end. The group soon falls apart, and although they all try their own ventures, the only one who really takes off and has a thriving career into the new decade is Harry Styles, who starts a new band called Harry and the Hairstyles, who win critical acclaim with their unique brand of Baroque pop. So, in attempting to convert What Makes You Beautiful into a 60s bubblegum track, my first step as ever was just getting the boys' vocals, dropping them into GarageBand and syncing them up to the grid. I lowered the tempo a little bit because it's a pretty driving up tempo number, and I wanted a little bit more of that kind of later 60s, slightly funky kind of bounce to it. So just took it down a couple of notches. I also realised listening to the isolated vocal that was going to be my main obstacle in trying to make it sound remotely like the 60s, just because of the production on it. It's very processed, very tuned, the backing vocals especially. That's not to say that the guys in the group necessarily needed that level of auto-tuning. It's a production choice, it's not like a necessity thing, it's just the sound they were going for, but it makes it sound not very 60s. So I did what I could to try and make it sound more of the era, narrowed down the EQ to make it sound a bit less sort of hi-fi and modern, added a bit of vintage reverb to it, and then also just added quite a lot of overdrive to just give it that old kind of Valve mixing desk saturation that you hear on those older records. Next thing was some drums, so picked a nice retro sounding kit, played the drums in on my MIDI keyboard for that more human, slightly swinging kind of feel. I figured on a bubblegum track it'd be being played by a session player, so it's mostly fairly restrained, but then I've got a few big, very 60s fills in there too, just to add a bit of excitement. Also added a bunch of additional percussion just to really reinforce that beat, make sure it's hitting hard and it's nice and danceable for the kids. So we've got some hand claps that come in, and we've got some tambourine and shaker as well at different points as well, just to make sure it's a nice, really punchy rhythm there. The bass was next. I tried to just go for a fairly woolly, old-fashioned sound. Lots of bass, not too much treble, so quite full and rich, and kept it quite lively. I was just trying to think of the sort of bass lines you get from rock musicians who've been listening to quite a lot of old Motown records, that kind of feel. The guitars were next. There's 3 guitars in total on there, so I've got an acoustic rhythm guitar that is mostly just hammering out the chords, although sometimes it's just playing a little muted single note thing, doubling up the bass. It's partly filling out the harmony, but it's also providing an extra sort of rhythmic texture too. So we've got that on there. We've also got an electric rhythm guitar with a nice vintagey, slightly breaking up sound, not distortion, but moderately edging into overdrive, mainly playing chordal stuff, either stabs or out and out strumming. And then for the third guitar, because I'm envisaging this coming out around 1968, I thought, well, well. The producers might add a little nod to psychedelia in there, so I've just got the third guitar with a horrible 60s octave fuzz tone, playing little riffs, mainly in the chorus. It's not very high in the mix, but it's just in there, adding that little slight nod to the counterculture. Then I figured I'd throw some organ on there, so nice, warm, kind of Hammond B3 sound. Nothing very involved, I'm not a great keyboard player, but it's just in there, adding another element. It adds a bit more of that sort of soul feel to things as well, which I wanted to get in there, so that's just in there, adding more texture. And then, because a lot of those Bubblegum records are pretty elaborately produced, I figured we'd throw some orchestral sounds on there too. So I've got some strings. I've got pizzicato strings from the Spitfire Audio BBC Symphony Orchestra set, but then for the longer string sounds I used GarageBand's Mellotron string sounds, just because they've got that retro sound to them. Not very elaborate orchestration. A lot of the time it's just literally doubling the vocal melody, but that just adds that syrupy, sugary edge to things. And because we're emphasizing the slightly soul influenced nature of things too, I thought we needed some horns. So I've got 4 horns on there: trumpet, sax, trombone, and then adding in a tuba later on as well. And it's mostly just chordal stabs and a couple of little lines, but it just really fills the sound out. Then for the video, pretty simple video, just started with some footage of One Direction performing the song shortly after it came out. Popped it into black and white just to make it feel like it's the 1960s, and then wanted a 60s looking band to be back in them. So figured, since Edison Lighthouse was one of the inspirations that I leaned on for the track, I'd use them. So took a couple of different TV performances of Love Grows Where My Rosemary Goes and edited little sections of that in. And then just for a final bit of detail, just found a couple of old 60s magazine covers that I tweaked a bit to edit the One Direction into it, just to look like they were part of the pop scene back in the day as well. So I hope you enjoyed this one. I don't know how authentic a job I managed to do on this, but I love that old 60s bubblegum stuff. So it was good fun trying to take a sort of 21st century bubblegum song and just take it back through the years. Let me know what you think down in the comments, and if you did enjoy it, please like, share, subscribe. All that stuff really helps the channel. If there's anything else you'd like me to do in coming weeks and months, any artists, songs or genres you'd like me to investigate, do let me know. I always welcome your suggestions. But otherwise, that's all from me for this week, so thanks very much indeed for watching, and I will hope to see you next time.